Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. The world, it seems, is getting ever more unsettled as terrorism rears its ugly head around the world and as countries vie with one another for supremacy. It seems hardly a day goes by without further tensions escalating somewhere on the planet. In the light of the Brexit referendum, risks concerning the forthcoming US election, immigrant turmoil across Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, geopolitical threats and global economic downgrades. How should the world move forward? Are we, as many doommongers would have us believe, actually heading for another world war? To address these issues, I'm joined in the studio by Professor James Ray from California State University in Sacramento and by Professor M.D. Nalapad from Manipur University in India. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Back to talks. After 3 years of hiking tensions over the South China Sea, new Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte chose a different way to his predecessor Aquino III and decided to resume talks with China over territorial disputes. President Duterte is reportedly speaking to former President Fidel Ramos about becoming the Philippines' envoy to China for talks. It would be the first time for Filipino officials visiting China since a tribunal in Hague released a ruling on the arbitration filed by Aquino's government. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said China welcomes the move. China has always insisted on bilateral talks as the solution of territorial disputes. Leaders in the region agree that the arbitration case has complicated the situation.
I think the real issue is that something like the South China Sea, both sides need to sit together and have a discussion.
The fault lines between us and among us that we have, that we can manage all these problems peacefully, diplomatically, without violence.
China has openly voiced its stance on the disputes, insisting that the arbitration ruling on the South China Sea case will have no impact on China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights in the region. So far, China has signed boundary agreements through bilateral negotiations with 12 of the 14 countries it shares a border with, under the principle of equal consultation and empathy. Through talks, China and Vietnam has also reached a consensus on the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf limits of the territorial waters in the North Gulf, a clear signal of China's sincerity for good relations.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir. Given the security dilemma, particularly the standoff between the US and China over the South China Sea, what do you think of the most viable options that could be put on the table at this moment to avoid further escalation?
Well, I think the best option would frankly be for all the parties concerned to basically declare that they are not going to use force as an option to resolve any of these disputes. I think it's very important to ensure that force be off the table in the resolution of disputes in the Asian region. Now, we don't want Asia to go the way of Europe in the past and go into that kind of situation. A rising Europe, there were many wars in the rising when the economies and the countries of Europe were rising. I think Asia needs to avoid that.
James, it seems all parties concerned in the dispute have exercised self-restraint in the current crisis that is quietly escalating but not beyond control. What do you think of the reasons behind their ability to maintain a quiet attitude?
Well, I think countries like the Philippines realize they don't want to antagonize China and in fact may reach out for a negotiated solution that bypasses the arbitration. I think major powers like India or the United States see this as not really altering the nature of the dispute and only gives ability to perhaps find a way to limit the tensions in the region, because we see this as a catalytic moment that might upset China's perspective.
There is a voice in China which is not very strong, but one of the reasons arguing that the ruling could be viewed as a catalyst for finding a positive solution instead of causing a military standoff between the US and China. Do you think there are some legitimate points behind this argument?
Well, the Chinese philosophy has always been a win-win philosophy. And I think if that philosophy is carried out in practice, you can construct a system in which all the countries who are there, I mean, we're putting the issue of sovereignty aside, all the countries that are there can cooperate in such a way that everyone is benefited. So I think the Chinese as a global power, as in fact, along with the United States, a global superpower, I think the Chinese can use their special talents and their historical background to ensure that a win-win solution is presented, which can be accepted by the regional partners.
Do you think there are different voices between the Pentagon and the State Department over whatever options on the table? Do you think people like Harry Harris, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, is among all the representative of hawks who argue for military actions overnight?
Well, I think the legal ruling could provide a cover for the United States to provide the mutual defense treaty with the Philippines some weight, and could lead the U.S. to be a little bit more assertive and encourage the Philippines to take a more confrontational stance. However, I think the new president of the Philippines may not wish to antagonize China and may not want to follow that path, and so those in the United States that would like to see this resolved through multilateral negotiations or some kind of dialogue, I think will ultimately hold sway in the U.S. foreign policy.
Professor Nalapad, do you think the newly elected president in the Philippines will be a game changer? But he said, after winning the campaign, with regard to the South China Sea disputes, that he would first turn to the US, Japan, Australia, for example, for the immediate consultation before having possible consultation and negotiations with the Chinese. Although he said he would appoint Fidel Ramos, the former president of the Philippines, to go to as a special envoy to go to Beijing and undertake this special mission. What do you think of the relationship between the Philippines, the United States, Japan, Australia and China in constructing constructive discourse?
Well, I think the new president would like to have the support of these countries when he does sit down to negotiation with China. But the situation is the people in the Philippines, like the people across the region, they want economic development. You can't get economic development unless there is a peaceful situation. So I quite agree with James. I don't think the president of the Philippines is going to take a stand which could lead to a rise in tension or an escalation of tension. As a country, I don't think the Philippines will gain at all. Let's not forget the fact that over the last 20 years, China has become deeply embedded in the prosperity of Asia and other parts of the world. And if you upset that equation, then you're actually upsetting a foundation of prosperity.
As the biggest trading power in the world, China has global stakes, and we have every reason to guarantee freedom of navigation and free commerce in the Asia-Pacific region. But whatever we say, China cannot be fully trusted by the United States. And in fact, the systematic and strategic mistrust between the PRC and the United States would always come across as the major obstacle in the serious improvement of the bilateral relationship and in easing tensions in the South China Sea. Now, what would be the solution?
Well, I think one American perspective would be that the aspect of the ruling that questioned the 9-dash line, which really doesn't have a strong basis in international law. If China were willing to accept the removal of that claim and then assert the island claims that it might have a stronger case to make, I think that could move us into the dialogue that gets China in a position where it has control of the islands and it has the EEZs.
James, you know, this is an issue of domestic politics. It's unrealistic to persuade the Chinese authorities to give up the historical claims about the 9-dash line. What about the policy of ambiguity? Instead of talking tough on yes or no in black and white terms, I mean, that will push China into a corner, Professor.
Well, I'd like to point out that, India and China had a very unfortunate situation in 1962. Subsequent to that, there have been several rounds of discussion. And although nothing very concrete has come of the discussion, one thing is clear: no bullets have been fired from China or from India on that boundary ever since that period. It's been a very peaceful boundary. So I think in the South China Sea, what is very important is that there is the maintenance of peace. And in that, a dialogue is important. Now, whether the dialogue leads somewhere fast or leads somewhere slow, the importance is to have a dialogue and to ensure that no side believes that recourse to force is the way forward.
Dialogue is always better than the use of the military forces. However, there are two kinds of dialogue, don't you think so? One is you talk to each other, the other you talk past each other, but you look like talking to each other. What do you think of the talk about talk? Do you think this will be a war of attrition? Do you think this will become the new normal in the South China Sea?
Well, I don't think so. I think the Philippines and China already have the kind of bilateral dialogue that allows a resolution between the two parties, which I think would be China's preference. Vietnam and China, Malaysia and China. I think these bilateral dialogues will occur. In ASEAN, and ASEAN +3 provides China that opportunity to have a multilateral dialogue without the United States presence. I think that's a very useful forum for China and for Southeast Asian countries. And I don't think it's necessary for the U.S. to be a mediator or be involved, and that could be resolved simply by the Asian countries that have the primary stakes.
Let's look at the recent British-Iraq War Inquiry report, which found out that there was no imminent threat from Saddam Hussein in March 2003, whom both Britain and the United States claimed possessed weapons of mass destruction that have not been found to this day. Well, Tony Blair has apologized, not so genuinely, but he has apologized after the Chilcot report was released. That reminds us of the military interventionism undertaken by the U.S. government since the end of the Second World War. Wherever the United States was involved in the military interventions, disasters appeared in the aftermath. Hence, in hindsight wisdom, many argue for non-interventionism, and many in China view the military presence of the U.S. Navy in the South China Sea as yet another form of interventionism. It could only add to the unpredictability and uncertainty, if not turmoils, the next day. What do you think of the Chinese concerns?
Well, I'd like to say that from the U.S. after the Second World War, the military has always been a very important component of U.S. policy. Even towards Europe, you have NATO, you have the U.S. presence there. In practically all parts of the world, the U.S. military has been a very important component of policy. I don't think that is going to change in Asia, and I don't think it's going to change anywhere, in any of the areas that we're talking about. That's going to be a fact of life. The point which surprises me is the complete lack of accountability. Now, thousands of lives were affected, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, an entire country was thrown into chaos, and all that we have got out is an apology. Now, in any other situation, Mr. Blair would have had to face a war crimes tribunal. Some of the people who were responsible for this would have had to face a war crimes tribunal. But there seems to be zero accountability. And that is very surprising to me. I'm a believer in international law. I'm a believer in the consequences for wrong actions. And the Iraq war completely damaged the fabric of society in Iraq and killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, the fact that there's zero accountability and not even a pretense of accountability is very worrying to me, because it encourages people to do similar reckless actions in other parts of the world, knowing that they'll be completely immune from any accountability.
Few have been brought to justice because of their involvement in the war crimes, quote unquote, since the Vietnam War, war on Iraq, so on and so forth. Is it true that none of the major powers, particularly the P5, have ever complied with international laws? Rulings of the arbitral tribunal, for example. The United States is not a party to UNCLOS. Neither did it sign the Kyoto Protocol. It's not a party to the ICC, International Criminal Court. And therefore it's difficult to persuade major powers to accept international law. Will this set a very bad example? But the United States, by the way, prefers to lead by example. What do you think of this note of irony? Is it an embarrassment?
Well, I think it is an embarrassment, and sometimes undermines America's strategic positioning by the virtue of not participating in the courts you mentioned. The U.S. has lost at the International Court of Justice a far more important case, Nicaragua against the United States in 1986. The United States has lost at the PCA before on the Hawaiian Kingdom's sovereignty, a kind of obscure issue. I think the United States would be better served to participate in the ICC and to ratify the UNCLOS treaty, and then have the kind of equal standing in the discussions, and I think it's perfectly valid for China to criticize the United States' lack of participation in that treaty and not therefore have standing. And certainly I agree with Professor Nalapad about the legacy of the Iraq War and the fact the British, which were the second partner, had this kind of in-depth investigation. The United States has not performed any kind of inquiry or investigation in the same manner that the British have done, and I think that's also a tragedy.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. You are watching Dialogue with Professor Amdi Nalapad and Professor James Ray. We are discussing implications of the UNCLOS, the international arbitration, as well as why major powers refuse to comply with international laws, whether that will deliver negative impact upon the rest of the world. We'll be back in a few minutes. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Now, yet another crisis is emerging larger, the deployment of THAAD in South Korea. It seems a new Iron Curtain is descending on the Pacific or the Asia-Pacific region, starting from South Korea, where the deployment of THAAD only fuels the anger of the Chinese and the Russians. And that Iron Curtain stretches from Northeast Asia to the South China Sea, where we have the military standoff. However, no one would say this is a new Cold War. But isn't it a spirit of the Cold War that is coming back, James?
Well, I think it's a provocative action despite being a defensive mechanism that is directly intended to limit and deter North Korea or Iran, but is also implicitly to constrain China and Russia's regional influence. And so I think it's understandable that the U.S. has the technology and will continue to pursue these kind of defensive mechanisms, but it's also going to antagonize and reflects the security dilemma that will lead Russia maybe to be a little forward in its posture and China to be upset.
Professor Yoon from Seoul, South Korea, argued at the just concluded World Peace Forum hosted by Tsinghua in Beijing that China's position to maintain strategic stability in the divided Korean Peninsula has actually encouraged the young leader in the DPRK to continue with the nuclear test. And therefore, South Korea has legitimate reasons to justify the deployment of a THAAD, which would only add to the tensions in Northeast Asia, according to the Chinese and the Russian governments. Do you think what he says carry any water or a ring of truth?
I don't believe that President Kim of North Korea is taking any kind of advice or dictation from any other country. I think he's the head of a system that is now more or less taking its own decisions. So I really don't believe that there is very much of influence of China or any other country on his core action. I think the main action is regime continuance, to protect his regime. And for that, I believe he believes that that nuclear weapons may be necessary. Now, we have seen what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. When Gaddafi gave up his WMD, when Saddam gave up his WMD, we know what happened to both of them. And we know that even after the Syrian Bashar Assad gave up his chemical weapons, still there's been an unceasing attack on him, and diplomatically the pressure has not eased. So I think, unfortunately, these are very bad examples, frankly, of individuals who have given up their WMD, and still they have been, two of them have been killed, and one of them is sought to be, frankly, removed, probably in a very brutal way. So this is a very bad example, which I think President Kim is looking at. I think that is what is driving his policy. I don't think it's China. So far as THAAD is concerned, I simply want to point out that Israel, for example, has got a lot of security from the Iron Dome. But for the Iron Dome, a lot more Israeli lives would have been lost from these rocket attacks. In the same way now, Seoul is very close to the border of North Korea. It's less than a minute away, frankly, of missile flying time. So I think it is this terrible insecurity, the fact that they are so close to a formidable military machine, which has got missiles, which is now getting nuclear weapons. I think that is what is driving the desire to have this system. I don't think it is because of any kind of, any kind of negativity towards Russia and China. I don't think South Korea would be thinking at all in terms of any kind of a conflict with China or Russia.
Well, I think that reaffirms why China is not interested in putting international laws on ballistic missile tests or nuclear weapons, because it pulls the United States military closer into the region and somewhat lures these kind of defensive mechanisms that are also going to antagonize, for legitimate reasons, China and Russia. So I think China is unable to cajole President Kim to curtail those policies, but certainly China has worked very actively through the six-party talks to try to gain North Korea's acquiescence to international standards.
The issue is whether the DPRK can be given the security assurance. Now, after 9/11, President Bush said bad behavior of the DPRK should not be rewarded, meaning they wanted to seek regime change, and therefore the discourse by Professor Nalapad, in fact, he wanted to explain why the young leader in the DPRK wanted to use the WMD to protect its own regime, to survive in the first place. So how can we persuade the DPRK that no regime change will be prioritized on the agenda of the new US government?
Well, I think to echo Professor Nalapad, I think it's in North Korea's interest to continue their programs because it does guarantee their sovereignty and national security, and the alternatives are to put in jeopardy the regime and the certainly risk of a collapse that would lead to prosecution or killing of the leader. So it's not in their interest to give up the program.
Here are two issues. One is the current quiet negotiation between Tokyo and Washington as to the possibility that President Obama wants very much to give up the preemptive nuclear strikes, and that will utterly change the Japanese traditional reliance on the nuclear umbrella that the United States holds in its hands. The next issue, I'm afraid, is in the absence of the six-party talks, there is actually no multilateral security institution whatsoever in this region, and that would be very dangerous. Look at the other places around the world. You have the Organization of African Unity, you have the Organization of Islamic States, you have the Summit of Americas in the Western Hemisphere. So you have similar organizations in different parts of the world, except for Asia, where you see the dynamics of arms race, mounting tensions, flashpoints in the wake of the Cold War, one way or another, and yet we don't have a reliable and regular security mechanism to prevent and control a crisis.
Well, I think, that the maturity of the Asian people is the most important guarantee. Now, I didn't buy, for example, into this. There was a lot of talk about 15 years ago that there would be a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. I mean, I wrote in the, I think it came in the Washington Times, other papers, this is absolute nonsense. In my view, there is no question of nuclear war between India and Pakistan for a simple reason that certainly India does not want Pakistan territory, and Pakistan knows it will be suicidal to launch a war in India. Now, these are sensible people. Now, even so far as North Korea is concerned, we have seen Saddam Hussein declared multiple times that he had no weapons of mass destruction. He allowed the inspectors to come back, but Mr. Bush had already made up his mind to invade. You have Gaddafi, who gave up his WMD. You have other instances of people who have given up and still been attacked. So given that, unfortunately, it is coldly logical on the part of President Kim to believe that he cannot trust assurances from powers that have broken their assurances to other dictators in the past.
Before we come back to discuss any options concerning the building of a security mechanism in the Asia-Pacific region, what do you think of, say, the American newcomers? Are they still maintaining any influence in the United States? The newcomers argue for the use of force to replace a government of tyranny, a dictatorship such as Saddam Hussein. And Mr. Tony Blair said Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. He got to go. Hence, he took side with the U.S. in the invasion of Iraq.
Well, I think it's a narrow ideology among elite circles in foreign policy and think tanks in Washington, but one that is well-funded and has access to power. In a sense, fortunately, Donald Trump has no good connections to that group and has kind of criticized America's past intervention policies along the neocon line. Hillary Clinton has actually attracted a little bit of support from some of these groups and may be more likely to follow a belligerent foreign policy that could include interventions. So I think they are limited for now, but ironically they might appear and spring up on the Democratic side, if anywhere.
Let's look at the spillover or political fallout of military interventionism, because we've been talking about punishment of dictators, regime change, and security assurance. Ever since the Arab Spring that grabbed the headlines, we not only have the refugee crisis in the European Union, the Brexit campaign and the negative impact, but also the latest lorry attacks in Nice, a popular seaside summer resort and tourist attraction. Now it seems, and by the way, the ISIL has claimed responsibility for this terrorist attack. By the way, it is a lone wolf attack, which according to many sources of information would be hardly predictable and therefore very difficult to prevent. What do you think of the consequences of the rise of Islamic extremism, which turned to the use of force against innocent civilians?
Well, I just want to add to what James was saying about Hillary Clinton. She was a strong proponent of taking out Gaddafi. She is even today a very strong proponent of taking out Bashar Assad. Now, the Bashar Assad may not be a very desirable person, but the alternative to him is Mr. Baghdadi's people. Now, in the Second World War, you had a situation in which Churchill and Roosevelt made an alliance with Stalin, not because Stalin was a great person, but because he was better than Hitler. Unfortunately, that similar kind of logic seems to have been absent in many modern leaders, especially in the United States and Europe. And Libya, the Syrian intervention, Iraq, the manner in which this has happened has directly resulted in what we see as ISIS. So this situation that Europe is facing of mass migration, of terrorism, these are situations that have been predicted by strategic scholars in Asia. For example, there are strategic scholars in Asia who early on in the spring of 2011 itself said the Arab Spring is going to become a Wahhabi winter. The Wahhabis are going to organize and they're going to take control. So let's be honest. The problem is that you have people in the Western world who are living 100 years in the past, who still believe they can dominate other countries and who can rule over other countries and decide what other countries should do.
The year before last, I visited the Brookings Institution, and when I said exactly what you pointed out, many policymakers in the United States were still living in the 20th century. They were angry with me. Well, with that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue about the South China Sea as well as the issue of terrorism. We'll be talking about this in the next round of discussion. Until then, goodbye.